initial assumptions. Then we're going to use these MVPs to see if we could get early orders or some kind of validation. And that's the second step of customer discovery for development. The first step of customer development is discovery. The second step is validation. You know, the other trap I used to fall into as a founder, which big companies didn't have so much of this problem, is people would say, hey, that's great, come back, you know, when you have a finished product, which usually meant you were actually thrown out of their building, but you kind of took it as a, oh, they love my product. What I wanted to see was early validation in some form, in the form of usage or orders or whatever, on a buggy, unfinished product, which would give you some insight whether people actually wanted to grab this thing out of your hand as well. The third step is, so there was customer discovery, customer validation. Excuse me. The third step is, once you had early evidence, what I called customer creation, which was scale. How do I actually, you know, put the dollars into whether it was buying AdWords or hiring Salesforce or whatever, you know, direct sales or something else. When do I do that and how do I scale? Which was trying to solve another problem I saw of startups in the 20th century. They would write a plan, raise capital from investors, and assume that the first thing they needed to do was create end user demand early on, whether it's advertising or back then PR or lots of money, without ever doing any discovery or validation. And they were attempting to do what I call premature scaling. And the last step in customer development was, how do you grow from a very small team into a company that actually gets past the first 8 or 16 or 45 people? And that was company building. And so that was customer development. And it grew from there into the lean startup with 2 additions. So the first piece of lean was essentially the customer development process. And I had written a book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which kind of articulated and enumerated the steps and had some workbooks of what to do. And I have to tell you, I just described probably in more detail than your listeners probably ever want to hear, but it took me 3 years to come up with the idea because it was so heretical at the time. I mean, now we take for granted, well, of course you get out of the building. Of course, these are untested hypotheses. Of course, a business plan might be great later, but right now when you're doing a business plan, and it's the best example of creative writing ever, it ought to be taught in the English department rather than in business schools. So it was kind of hard to get my head around. And then one of my students, who I had invested in his company and I was teaching back then in the business school at UC Berkeley, I made him and his co-founder take my class on customer development. His name was Eric Rees. And Eric Rees became the first practitioner ever of the customer development process. And his major contribution was educating me that in the 21st century, engineers were no longer doing waterfall engineering, that is building products serially, that the perfect fit for customer development was agile engineering, building products iteratively and incrementally, which solved our ability to, and created the ability to do minimum viable products incredibly rapidly. And Eric, of course, went off to be the main proselytizer of the whole methodology, wrote a great book called The Lean Startup. And then the last piece was, I was talking about all these hypotheses, but there was really no way to visualize them and easily. You had to write them down and you'd hand them to other people, but you couldn't quite see them. Alexander Osterwalder came up with something called the business model canvas. And he originally designed it for strategic planning in large corporations where the canvas was static. That is, it didn't change much. You used it and there it was. I realized that if you used the canvas as a dynamic document, that is crossing out and changing and stacking them up as week to week as you discover things, you actually could use them as kind of a way to create a timeline of what you've learned in early stage ventures. And so Osterwalder and I teamed up, and the business model canvas became the third piece of the Lean Startup. So the Lean Startup was basically the first tool set specifically designed for early stage ventures. And again, it consists of customer development, agile engineering, and the business model canvas. And of course, later on, it ended up on the cover of the Harvard Business Review in 2013 and gave large companies permission to kind of say, well, maybe we ought to start using some of these tools to deal with disruption in our own businesses.
Yes, thank you so much. That was very detailed and complete. I have a question for you. So as an entrepreneur or a founder, you have your vision, and then you go out and you create your hypothesis. You go out to the customers and they start telling you, oh, I want this, I want that, I want this. And so how do you balance that with your vision so you don't end up being sort of a job shop for these early customers?
That's a great question. In fact, that's the B school dilemma. It's, oh, listen, I went out and I took all the feature requests and here we go. And I'm going to tell you a great story happened in one of my classes. Our students have to go out and in 10 weeks, they speak to 100 customers and partners and regulators doing customer development and make 5 to 10 MVPs. And they test every part of the canvas, including pricing. And one week, this team went out and they had an app, what they thought was an app, and they were testing pricing. And because I make them blog all their customer discovery interviews, I kind of knew by class time what they had found. And they presented, and then they have to stand and deliver in front of the teaching team and the rest of their peers every week about here's what we thought, here's what we did, here's what we found, and here's what we're going to do next week. And so they said, well, it was obvious, we spoke to, now a total of 45 people, and our price, it ought to be an app at $9.99. And I said, great, that's, great. You did some great customer discovery. How'd you come up with $9.99? Well, we spoke to 45 people, Professor Frank, and here's our spreadsheet. I said, put up the spreadsheet for everybody. I said, well, what happened to the top and bottom numbers? Oh, they were outliers. We threw them out. Well, tell the class what the top 3 outliers said. Oh, that was data that we just thought was so off the scale, we threw it out. Well, what did it say? Oh, it said we ought to be a piece of enterprise software. They pay $10,000 or more for this. Now I made the class stop and said, this is the difference between using customer development as a giant focus group versus being an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur would have said, there's a signal in this noise here, and let's go investigate why 3 people were willing to grab this thing out of my hand and pay me $10,000. And I was thinking that what I needed to do was just average the price of what people said they pay. And that's a long story just to remind folks, customer discovery and validation is not a giant focus group. It's designed to inform the founder's vision. That's very different from a focus group. You do focus groups in large corporations when you have existing business models and you're validating the next product or the next feature or the next pricing. But for founders, for early stage ventures, it's actually designed to do a couple things. One is the path I'm on correct? But 2 is it's to elucidate whether there's any signals out there that you're missing. And 3 is it's to make sure, as you pointed out, that you're not just becoming a job shop. And so you're trying to look for things that are pulling you in the same bore site, plus or minus maybe 15 degrees. But you're always looking for those outliers as well. Does that answer the question, Caroline?
Yeah, it definitely does. No, it's a hard balance to deal with. But your example was really good. So my next question is, so for this customer discovery approach, does it matter if it's a new market, existing market, or an environment that we currently are where we don't really know what the future will look like?
That's an excellent question, because, Steve Jobs used to love to say as well, if I would have asked customers, or if Henry Ford would have asked customers, they would have ended up with a horse with 6 legs rather than an automobile. And, and Jobs was proud that he didn't talk to anybody. And actually, he was just simply wrong. Jobs just had some of the best customer instincts of, and the best intersection between art and science of, probably since Walt Disney. But he actually was seeing customers, and he actually was observing what was going on outside. He just had, just incredible talent for observation. But to answer your question, it turns out, if you think about it, if you're in an existing market, and let's define an existing market, a very simple definition is go ask a customer, what market is this product in, as if they could tell you it's TLA, it's a 3-letter acronym, oh yeah, we're in the X market. All of a sudden, those customers, if you ask them questions, could tell you what would improve, their propensity to buy from you? Is it cheaper? Is it faster? Is it more features? Is it something else? You can have a very interesting customer discovery question with customers in an existing market. They could tell you how they use adjacent products, et cetera. But now let's just have that same conversation, and you just invented something that never existed before. And the customers can't tell you the name of the market because they don't even know what it does. They'll hold it upside down, they'll shake it, they'll try to put it in their ear. It's like, what is this? Now, all of a sudden, if you ask those same discovery questions about, would you like it 30% faster? They like, well, what? What are we talking about? And so in a new market, you still need to get out of the building, but your discovery is actually quite different. What you're trying to understand is what's the day in the life of the customer today, and how will it be transformed by this product or service you're offering? And that requires you to kind of be, this is where the visionary thing comes into play. In an existing market, the customers can teach you the basis of competition. They can actually tell you, what it would take to have them grab it out of your hands. In a new market, you really need to see what are the elements that would create, demand for this product. Any ancillary things need to change? Do we need 5G to make this happen? Do we need new materials? Do consumer behavior have to change? By the way, this pandemic has just created an entirely new market for businesses we thought were fixed and static. Education, communication, work, all things, how we work, have just been upended, that everybody watching should understand we're in the world of new market, even though we thought we were in the world of existing market literally 90 days ago. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you. So now we're going to move over to talking about the current environment. So what's your advice to startups for surviving and thriving in this new environment?
Well, I think you got the order correctly, surviving and then thriving. I think a good number of startups, have discovered that, first of all, the funding environment has changed. If we were in a huge bubble where capital was in it and constant, if you had a good idea or if you graduated certainly from Wharton, great pedigree, is like people were standing at the door. That's kind of gone down. Even angel rounds have gone down because I think everybody is reassessing, what's in their lifeboat. Everybody's playing lifeboat strategy in the angel and venture world. So number one is, if I was depending on a next round at a certain point in my development and I was cash flow negative, I would suggest all rules are and all bets are off. It doesn't mean you're not going to get funded, but depending on the segment you're in and industry, I would be focusing on how to reach cash flow positive as soon as possible, if that was no longer, if it wasn't part of your plan. And if you were cash flow positive, I'd make sure I have 2 to 3 years of cash in the bank, because I think the funding environment has changed dramatically. For startups themselves, hopefully by now, everybody has kind of realized that the new normal isn't going to look like the old normal, and that they've reduced cash burn and they actually have a runway that could make them last much longer than they did before, and gone through all the steps necessary to reduce cash burn, including what's interesting is things that used to be fixed expenses like rent and lease payments, et cetera, are no longer fixed expenses. People are renegotiating leases and walking away from them and doing other things. And I'm not suggesting, all your listeners do that, but I'm just pointing out that the game has changed. And if you're somebody who owned buildings and workplaces, life is tough just because that's what people are doing to you. But most importantly, and for the purpose of this podcast, people ought to be thinking about what their new business model looks like. There's a great cartoon of the Roadrunner. I don't know if you remember those cartoons. And it's the Roadrunner, always trying to catch, or I don't know, what was it? Who was trying to catch the Roadrunner? Anybody remember what it was? It was whoever it was. Wile E. Coyote was trying to catch the Roadrunner. And there's always a great scene where he tries to go for him and he misses it and he runs off the cliff and he runs and he's like 15 feet off the cliff in the air until he realizes there's no cliff underneath him or no. That's in fact most startups who haven't redone their business model. You've just ran out of land, and you might be thinking you're still going, but the world has changed completely underneath you. And so every startup needs at least to reevaluate whether all their assumptions that they had on March 1st are still valid on June 1st. It's a big idea. Your customers? I don't think so. You know, maybe there are some segments that are the same, but I think the world is different and going to be different for at least the next 18 months. And that the recovery is going to be not in the way that people predict, and it's going to be demographically and geographically different. And it's going to be different for obviously industry segments like travel, but also classic B2B models are going to be upended as well. So long story to just simply say your business models need to be reevaluated. Your sales pipeline needs to be reevaluated. Your burn rate needs to be reevaluated. Who your customers are and who their customers are, if you were selling B2B, need to be reevaluated. It's all changed. And on that happy news.
So you have written before about different types of CEOs. So what qualities do you think the CEOs need to learn in order to survive in this environment?
You know, we use the phrase sometimes peacetime versus wartime CEO, you know, which on Memorial Day actually does a disservice to people who were in places where failure was measured and killed in action rather than you lost your corner office. But that said, the other thing that is interesting to note, that if you were in the Army and the Marines, you trained for the fight all the time. You ran battlefield drills all the time. And so dealing with, quote, a crisis was something you had at least trained for. For peacetime CEOs, that is the rest of us or founders today, you don't train for the world being upended, you know, overnight. While you might have great skills as an entrepreneur figuring out product market fit, you don't train for your entire customer base or the entire economy being turned upside down. And so very quickly, the difference between survival and not as a startup or even an existing company, you know, go see Hertz and Neiman Marcus and others, is to be able to figure out how to rapidly, you know, assess where you are, you know, orient yourself to what the new normal is, decide what to do, make business model changes, cash burn changes, access to new capital, you know, signing up for the payroll protection program, all this other stuff, and then act. And the act part is sometimes really tough. Even for startup CEOs who tend to act with alacrity, there is no rule book about how this is going to turn out and what it's going to look like. And so people are hesitating as they're, well, maybe I should do X, or maybe I should do Y, or maybe I should, you know, lay off 2% of the people and then maybe another 2% and another, you know, without realizing that all those kind of destroy your ability to kind of act later. You know, for example, if you're going to cut, you ought to only cut headcount or people once, because if you do it multiple times, everybody's going to be looking over their shoulder, you know, week to week, going, what's the next shoe going to drop? It destroys productivity and morale continually, rather than just the one time. People have to get over it, and then they realize when it's done. What was your question, Caroline? Sorry, I got off on
no, I just talked about the characteristics that a CEO in this environment needed to have.
So the ability to act with and observe, orient themselves, decide and act. And in the military, it's called the OODA loop. It's basically the way to deal with lots of inputs coming in, figuring out what you need to do, and then acting. You know, if anybody tells you they know how this is going to end up in the economy in the next year, it's just wrong. But the one thing that probably is right is that it ain't going to be the same, at least for most segments. And by the way, there are a few market segments that are actually, you know, going to thrive. And if you're lucky enough to be in one of those, you also ought to act to be able to take advantage of talent that you could never have acquired before, or assets, physical or or intellectual that are available that will never be available again. And so you also need to act if you're one of those lucky industry in one of those lucky industries and markets that are growing.
Yes, and yeah, no, that makes sense. So, so what do you think are the important learnings from this this crisis? You start off saying, you know, before cash was really plentiful and it was all about scaling, 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 and now cash is no longer available in the same way. So of course, getting to profitability as soon as possible might be one of the learnings from here, but what are other learnings that you think we will have learned from this crisis?
You know, I live in, and we're podcasting from California, where every couple of decades we have a major earthquake. And for years after that earthquake, there are millions of people who don't look at the ground the same way they looked at it before. You used to think of the ground as solid and completely immovable. And after you've seen the earth ripple and buildings sway, you kind of understand that that's just a temporary phenomenon and could, liquefy at any time. I think number one, and I know it's not the exact question you were asking, but I'll start here, is that none of us who grew up or have experienced this will ever view the economy or health and safety the same way. We will all be permanently affected in how we think about business and the economy and how fragile it all is after this event. So I just wanted to start there. And Caroline, ask me again the second part again of your question.
What are their learnings that we can?
Yeah, so that was the first learning I think people just ought to process, is that you'll never look at what you thought were a set of immutable facts about the economy, about funding, about startups, and about businesses, and about safety and health the same way. I think, let me not paint doom and gloom. Risk capital is going to come back. It was hard to kind of raise $20 million for Zoom, get a Series A and B. That was just kind of, for most companies, shut down. Some investors were still doing that. And again, angel investors were trying to figure out what was going on. And it's not that, checks went to zero. I was still writing checks, but boy, I was writing a lot more. It was only people I knew, not people I normally would interview and have coffee with and whatever. And that will come back as well. But I think people are going to be a bit more conservative for a while until they understand how the economy is going to recover. 15% unemployment obviously affects, every business in the United States. And given the same economic downturn is happening in countries across Europe and even China, we're going to see global demand change, supply chain changes, et cetera. So I think people will be more conservative about how they burn cash, and it might be the days of blitz scaling, meaning, I'll just go for it, raise $100 million, assume that, it's there for round, may not be the new normal anymore. We might go back to more conservative models of building early stage ventures. But again, it might be it all recovers tomorrow. The problem is if you're depending on that, you're probably out of business. If you're in fact focusing on how do I be a little more conservative about cash and runway and have the ability to scale the minute cash becomes available, because I park some things in the lifeboat, is when this does recover, I will have the assets to do so. That might be a more interesting model. I think everyone should remember, number one, the sun still comes up every morning, and two is hopefully you're healthy and people around you are healthy and safe. But out of every crisis is an opportunity. There's going to be some huge new unicorns built in this pandemic. I think it's pretty obvious that we've educated billions of people how to remotely work, how to use Zoom. We've, changed the laws on how to do telemedicine and remote healthcare. you know, if any of your listeners have young kids, you clearly understand that there's enormous room for improvement on remote education. And the nature of commercial spaces in urban areas are going to be completely redesigned for them, you know, until there's a vaccine. And so huge opportunities that just didn't exist before. This was a, you know, this was a kind of an industry clearing event. It was almost like a mass extinction event for when the dinosaurs got wiped out. These little young mammals were scurrying underfoot, became the dominant species. I think we're going to see, you know, as the large companies get affected and wiped out and hobbled, new opportunities for new entrants that that will grow out of this. So out of crisis comes opportunity.
I definitely believe that. So I'm going to ask you the last question before we go to Q&A. So what's your advice? You have written about this advice to like seize the day. Like, how do you, like, yeah, to seize your day, how do you find those opportunities either as a person or as a startup?
Yeah. So let's do the startup one first, and then I'll do as a person. You know, it's sometimes hard, even for entrepreneurs, but even more so for existing companies. We've always been doing things like this. These were our customers. Here's our products. This is what our engineering looks like, our supply chain, our management. And it's kind of hard to kind of get your head out of, well, that may no longer be true. And so it's, I hate to say how simple it is, because it's not that simple, but it could start simple. Is let's go get our head out of our own assumptions and look outside and see what has changed. And my challenge to every company I've been dealing with is, you know, glad you're okay, glad people are healthy. Don't tell me how great it is. Don't tell me your VP of sales says the pipeline is just fine. You know, I want you to go out and tell me what's changed, because I want you, the CEO, and your C-level suite to get out of the building, in this case virtually. You know, Zoom is great for customer discovery, and start talking to your customers. How's their behavior changed? What do they think is going to happen? How their buying habits changed? And if you're selling B2B, what's going on with their customers? What are they seeing? I'll give you an example. You know, the pandemic has not affected geographies equally, right? If you just look at the numbers, East Coast has just been hit. But if you even look deeper at the numbers, you know, 30 to 40% of that, those deaths have been in nursing homes. If you look even deeper in the numbers, the demographic distribution is appalling. If you normalize age 50 as 1, if you're 60 to 70, you're 30x more likely to die. And if you're over 80, it's 180 times more likely to die. And if you're under 30, it's 0.07%, you know, times likely to die. Yet we've locked down the entire country instead of locking down the people who are most vulnerable. Go figure. And as I said, the geographies don't make sense either. They're not equally distributed. That being said, once you understand that, you'll understand perhaps some consumer behaviors. You know, I'm over 65. I'm not getting on an airplane or in a packed restaurant ever until there's a vaccine, versus, you know, kids who are 20 years old. You can make that choice. It's not that the virus is not a risk. Of course it is. But for that age group, it's 5x, not 180x more deadly than the flu. They can then make those types of judgments. And what I mean by that is that, you know, businesses won't recover in the same geographic and demographic way that we assumed before. Services will be different. Does that make sense at all?
Yes.
Now, for individuals, Caroline, what I've been telling everybody is that this is the time, particularly if you've been sitting at home, to kind of think about how do you want to live the rest of your life? This is an opportunity to kind of reevaluate what's important. You get very few times in your life, in your business career, to kind of say, stop. You know, let's think about, is this a job? You want to be in sales for enterprise software for the rest of your career? Great, nothing wrong with that. But you know what? Maybe, you know, you've been thinking about healthcare. Maybe you want to do something in diagnostics, medical diagnostics, or devices, or therapeutics, or work on education or something else that could make your life maybe more meaningful. Because your career, even when you're young, is both malleable, but you never realize that you only have about 15,000 days in your career. How do you want to spend all of them? So that's the advice I give people, is that this is an opportunity to reflect. And it's an opportunity also to get educated cheaply, that you could take online classes without enrolling somewhere, even Wharton has them, in areas that might not have been your major or expertise, to see if this might be an alternate career. And so figure out what's going to make your life going forward more meaningful. So let's take some questions.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to Shilpa.
Great, thanks, Carol. Hey, Steve. So our first question comes from Miriam, and she asks, you've had a front row seat to pursuit of increased diversity in the startup ecosystem. What are some insights that you've drawn that can help female and underrepresented founders thrive today and tomorrow?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's it's amazing. When I showed up in Silicon Valley, it was all white boys with boat shoes and khakis, and I still remember when Vinod Khosla became a venture capitalist, people used to point to him and say, "Oh, there's an Indian." So like, and now we kind of laugh, and I think we've seen over time the Valley, certainly venture capitalists, have become at least ethnically diverse. And the last decade or so, we've seen the rise of women, not fast enough, but penetrating the ranks of founders and venture capitalists as well. It turns out all my TAs who became VCs happen to be women. In fact, Ann Miraco, who was the co-founder of Floodgate, I introduced her to our partner, Mike Maples, and she was my teaching assistant at Stanford. And then others followed, Anna Khan and others. I think, if you're a woman founder, I think you should realize that there are still like VC firms who don't get it. And you could instantly tell by looking at their team page if they're a bunch of old white guys. I wouldn't be spending my time pitching them, even though their checks will cash. You could almost tell some of the biases built in. There are others that treat entrepreneurs as everybody has a great idea. I have just found that betting on women and women entrepreneurs is a great bet when I write checks, because and again, very dangerous to go into stereotyping, but different mindsets and different cultures and different views make companies actually more resilient and more successful in being able to capture opportunities. I have found women-run companies build much different and often much more effective cultures than the ones run by the traditional high testosterone, Silicon Valley types that Kleiner Perkins and Benchmark used to fund. I hope that was a good enough answer.
Yeah, that was helpful. I think the takeaway there is to look at the investors that you're going to see if they are diversified, because it's just like one indicator of. It's
a poker tell. Meaning, it's like, gee, if they're all a bunch of old white guys, they're probably like, it doesn't mean they won't, right? But the other thing is like, just you could ask, have you funded any women? You might be the first, or they might be desperate to fund one, but that shouldn't be the reason that you take their money. What you really want is a supportive team of investors who are just treating you as like another founder rather than I have one in my portfolio.
Absolutely. Okay, our next question comes from Culpy. So for capital intensive businesses, how do you recommend building an MVP?
Well, I think that assumes that the MVP is I got to show, a working model of my capital intensive piece, right? If you remember what I said, the Steve definition of an MVP is whatever gets you the most learning at any point in a time as you're doing discovery and validation. So an MVP is sometimes not just the product. I'll give you an example. I had students who wanted to put hyperspectral scanners on a drone and go over farm fields to measure water and nutrient This was a pretty good idea 5-6 years. And I got a call from them that said, hey, Professor Blank, we want to raise, back then it was a lot of money for a seed round, $3 million. And I go, oh, great, why? Oh, we want to build a drone. That's our MVP. And I said, it's not too late for me to change your grade. They said, what are you talking about? I said, I think I can give you a grade never seen at Stanford. It's a C. And they said, why? I said, well, what do you think the MVP is? They said, Professor Bang, let's explain it to you again. It's a drone with a hyperspectral scanner. We need to show people that, that's what we could do. And I said, well, what business are you in? And they explained again, drones are product. Are you sure? Is it the drone? Oh, no, we're going to show them a report of here's a map of your field and, here's the things that need no plants and nutrients. I said, so tell me again what your MVP is. Now, all your listeners should be thinking for a second, what was their MVP? Was it the drone? No, it was a 5-cent piece of paper with a report on it. And I said, if you want to act like entrepreneurs, you could fake it. And if you don't want to fake it, just fly an airplane over the fields, generate the report and show them that that's the MVP. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah.
That the MVP is not always, I have to build every feature of the product to
just
prove.
get something in their hands.
Yes. And sometimes you need to prove some piece of technology or something else. But if you're building a new chemical plant, you don't need to build the entire chemical plant to get funding. You might need to prove that some part of the process is much better than existing plants or something else. And so just worth thinking about that an MVP is almost never the finished product.
Yeah, that's good advice. Our next question comes from Jara. What's your advice to early stage founders who are finding some traction, but not the exponential organic growth they need? Do they iterate incrementally, or do you suggest they start over? And how do you know when to do which?
So this goes back to Caroline's question early on, which I thought was glad she brought up. If you're in an existing market and you're not getting people grab it out of your hands, then you don't have product market fit, and either you need to pivot. That is, again, existing markets will teach you everything. You're an existing market. They already are familiar with how to buy and what competition looks like, etc. If you don't have something that they go, wow, this is much better or much cheaper, or I get it, or whatever, it's time for you to listen to what they're kind of saying, because obviously you missed, this feature set match between customer needs and what you're building. But if it's a new market, that's different. If you're in a new market, then maybe you're on the flat part of the hockey stick. Remember, a curve in an existing market for sales ought to look like this as you take share from the incumbents. A sales curve in a new market is the canonical hockey stick, right? Flat, 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 and then hopefully exponential growth. So you ought to understand, is it because the market isn't mature enough or something else? Or you might be in a market you're trying to resegment. That is, it's a large market, but you're going after a niche, or trying to be, going after a specific customer segment, or you're trying to be a low-cost provider. That also is maybe a pivot might be required, because maybe you didn't understand the right requirements to take that segment. So before a restart, I kind of would ask that question about, what's the problem? Is it that I don't see the future yet and it hasn't come, or that I'm in an existing market and haven't found product market fit?
Yeah, that's good advice. Our next question comes from Tulo. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. What advice do you have for early stage founders that were entering industries that are adversely affected by COVID-19, like tourism? If they reevaluate their value hypothesis.
Don't enter the industry. Take the money and go home.
If they reevaluate their value hypotheses and believe they should still be valid when they get to the new normal, should they continue as before along their journey of validation with a more focus on cash flow? Or should they adapt their fundamental business model, customer base, to steer away from adversely affected segments of the crisis? And perhaps tourism isn't the best example for this question. Maybe industries.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I didn't understand the question as, should we continue beating our head against the wall some more? I mean, what was the point?
Yeah, so I think the question was, in an adversely affected industry, that they think will still be, their idea will still be valid in the new normal. Should they today continue along their journey of validation, or should they fundamentally change their business model?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult, but there's a contradiction in that first sentence, is that it's going to be, let's skip that one, because I just don't, we're going to spend
Okay.
time me trying to understand the question.
Sure.
There was a good one about healthcare and in life sciences from Amy. Can we take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Amy. So for life science industries, med devices are areas where you need FDA or other regulatory approval. How might you need to approach the MVP or customer development process differently?
Yeah, I want to pick this one because when I first came up with the customer development process, I said, working everywhere except in life sciences. And then I got approached by UCSF that said, well, we actually are the experts in life sciences and it will work here perfectly. Come and teach a class for us. And so I did, for therapeutics and devices and diagnostics and digital health. And it turns out customer development and MVPs work fine, but in a different way than you would think. So if you break down the life sciences business, and they're all, those segments are all different, but there's a huge regulatory component for, therapeutics, FDA, phase 1, 2, and 3, or for medical devices, whether it's a PMA or 510K. And then you need to worry about reimbursement, CPT codes, and, is this an existing code? Could you piggyback on other codes, et cetera? There are a ton of things you need to know about your business model that's different from, gee, I have great science in my new hip replacement or my new implantable device, or gee, how do I make money in a therapeutics business? Well, it might be about partnerships and licensing. For medical devices, it's like, no, I don't want to build a sales force because most medical device companies get acquired. So how do I kind of like figure that out? So thinking about that, the MVP is all about the product rather than the business model of how to make money as a business is a trap that most founders fall into on day one. Is, oh, I need to test my product. Well, let's just assume you could cure cancer. That's great. So, what's the path for your company to kind of license, sell, public, something else? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense.
Right.
Thank you. All right, so just going through these questions again. Let's see. All right.
How about one that says customers and investors see us similar to existing products? How do we highlight the difference quickly?
Yep. Let me,
Okay.
yeah, so often when we present, customers and investors compare us to products that already exist in the market, but that's not true. How does one highlight this difference quickly?
Yeah, I used to find that was believe it was a customer problem, and then I realized it was a failure of doing enough customer discovery. That is, if you think about it, you're thinking that the customers need to be able to see what your product value has, but it means you really didn't understand what problems they have. And what I mean by that is the first part of customer discovery is to get out of the building and deeply understand not who would buy your product, but what problem or need your product is going to fulfill. And if you can't rifle shot to somebody that says, listen, do you have, think about the hierarchy. One is you should be able to go into a company and see whether they have a problem because you've done enough discovery. The second is the only people you could talk to early on is people who not only have a problem, but know they have a problem. Why, yes, we know we have that problem. Then the third is that the only people you could talk to still is we know we have a problem, and we've been actively looking for a solution. So if you're not talking to those people, then you have to kind of like sell and whatever. But if you haven't done that early conversation of going, our product is targeted to solve this problem that people, when they hear it can be solved, they will say, where have you been? Does that make sense?
Yeah, you need to acutely define the problem and find those customers that are experiencing that problem, so yeah, it'll help you establish your market.
And if you're a great market, you create a problem where none existed. The twitchy knee problem, or the, hey, do you have itchy elbows problem? Or, well, yes, I didn't know that was like a defined problem. Oh, yes, it's the symptom of much better, worse things to come. So if you have an itchy elbow, you need my product. So it could be a problem that people already identify for, or you might be a marketeer and create a need where none existed.
Create a problem that people didn't know they had.
Hey, listen, if you watch enough infomercials at night, you'll see people have done that quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. So with 1 minute left, we'll take this question from Anita. What are your favorite resources for entrepreneurs?
Well, one is, I have to tell you, it's hard to believe, but in the 20th century, there were no blogs or books or information about entrepreneurship. Zero. None. I mean, nada. In fact, the only way in Silicon Valley even you could get information was having coffee with either CEOs or the few VCs that would actually deign to have coffee with you. So you were limited by your coffee bandwidth. Today, the world is flooded with great websites and information from, Wharton School and others, and great bloggers and great VCs, etc. Your biggest problem is your biggest problem is how to sort through who has the best advice for your specific domain. I follow some great VCs, Fred Wilson, of course, Brad Feld, and others, to Thomas Tungus for SaaS. Depending on your market and segment, there are different ones for life sciences. And they are different for following VC advice versus following other entrepreneurs who tend to blog. There's some great online classes and materials that are offered for free. I'm sure Wharton does. I know at Stanford, we have the STV program offers weekly entrepreneurial broadcasts with other entrepreneurs. I'm sure, as I said, Wharton has the equivalent of those. But the most important thing I have to tell you is not what you could find online, but what you find surrounding yourself in your career. And those are the mentors and coaches you attract. I was lucky enough to have a couple of mentors in my career that dramatically changed my outlook on how to become a better marketeer, or a better entrepreneur, or a better founder. And the sad part is, of course, it's kind of bittersweet, is at a certain point in your life, you realize that you've kind of caught up with your mentor, and it's time for you to kind of give back and mentor, the next generation. And Silicon Valley and all entrepreneurial clusters kind of have this notion of pay it forward, where people helped you in the past, and now it's your turn to, without asking for anything, to give back. And that's what makes our business of entrepreneurship and innovation kind of unique, is that we actually get smarter by actually learning from what others who've gone before us have done. In fact, this podcast being a good example of
the mentee becomes the mentor. It's more
really,
experience.
It's really kind of, and we've now gone through 3 or 4 generations in that. My mentors are luckily still around. But one of them, Gordon and Bell, was incredibly influential in my career. Another one named Ben Wegbright. Just amazing insights. And then 20 years later, I found myself being asked, how come you have these insights? And realizing that it's now my turn.
You had become the sponge, and then you had learned additional on top of that.
So it, hopefully who's ever watching will realize that it will be your turn, and that you do have kind of a social and moral obligation to not just take whatever success you have and park yourself next to a golf course, but every once in a while have some coffee with others who want to learn. So I hope this was helpful, and thank you for the great questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve, for your time today. I know it's Memorial Day, so really appreciate you making the time. Those are all the questions for today, but thank you everyone else to joining this morning from wherever you are. We've included a list of our upcoming events in the chat box. We will be distributing this video on our website, so if you missed part of it, you can always join later. And finally, be sure to follow Steve on his blog and on his Twitter account. Those details are also included in the chat box. All right, with that, I'll hand it back to Carol to close out. But thank you again for everyone for joining.
Okay, thank you, Shilpa. And Steve, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time. It's so generous of you to spend this morning with us and really giving back. We're so appreciated for the time that you spend and answering all our questions. So thank you so much for to you and your family. And I think with that, we are done. Thank you so much for Shilpa for asking all the questions, and to everybody for asking questions. And